Hi, we're Sophia and Nicole, and our presentation is on what adolescence looks like in other parts of the world, specifically non-industrialized third world countries. While in this class we learned a great deal about adolescence, the class was primarily focused on the experience of adolescence growing up in first world countries. We wanted to explore how adolescence is different in areas of the world that have less affluence, less accessibility to healthcare and education, and fewer laws protecting the rights of adolescents.
To start, it's important to note that the majority of adolescents live in developing countries. This chart from 2009 shows that only 12% of adolescents live in industrialized nations. The rest, 88%, live in developing countries. Even more important to note is that the least developed countries are home to about 1 in every 6 adolescents, or 17% of adolescents worldwide. This data shows us how we've been studying the lives of a very small percentage of teenagers. Of course, that group of adolescents are still important to know about, but it's important to put it all in perspective of the big picture and know that the majority of adolescents do not live in first world countries.
As discussed in this class, adolescence is a tricky concept to define because there are so many complicating factors which make adolescence an unclear time in one's life. While it's tricky in first world countries, adolescence is even harder to define in developing countries. As we have already learned, variety in individual experiences with puberty and overall development make it difficult to define, and that's a pretty universal notion. What's not so universal is how laws and labor impact adolescence. While in this class, we looked at how discrepancy in laws in the US, such as being able to drive at age 16 but not being able to vote until age 18, have adverse effect on adolescence, teens in third world countries often face much more severe and limiting laws. They're often legally treated as adults at extremely young ages, which can lead to early engagement in mature activities such as full-time occupations, marriage, and raising children.
Looking into laws further, it is clear that adolescents in developing countries suffer from laws, or lack of laws, which fail to protect their rights as adolescents. There is an overwhelming lack of clarity and inconsistency regarding the legal status of adolescents across countries and even within nations, and it poses a huge obstacle to adolescents. There are no international legal standards for an age of majority, which leads to further complications and variations in different countries. While in America, the lack of consistency between the age at which you can vote and the age at which you can drink can be an annoyance and an inconvenience, in developing countries, age discrepancies often pose more serious threats. For example, Iran has one of the lowest national ages of majority. Girls are considered adults and can therefore be married at 9 years old, way before they have even reached adolescence, while the legal age of majority for boys is 15. This difference in age of majority creates huge gender inequality and perpetuates domestic abuse and sexual assault as girls are married at extremely young ages and are therefore put into very vulnerable positions. Beyond what each nation's laws are, many developing countries fail to enforce ages of majority in terms of marriage and substance use, and therefore young adolescents and even children, as in Iran, are exposed to many things that adolescents in industrialized countries are strictly forbidden from and can't even imagine experiencing.
Although in industrialized countries, child labor is a foreign phenomenon, worldwide, 211 million children, or 18% of children aged 5 to 14, are economically active. These rates are the highest in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. Child labor is often very dangerous and puts children and adolescents at extreme risk for injury. Each year, 6 million work-related injuries occur among children. And beyond the negative health impacts that child labor has, there are numerous educational limitations associated with it too. Due to extreme poverty, adolescents are forced to work instead of attending school in order to help support their families, and as a result, their school attendance, grades, and ability to learn suffer extremely. This was an issue addressed in class, as it is prevalent in industrialized nations as well as developing countries. However, in underdeveloped nations, much younger adolescents and children engage in work, and the work is oftentimes hard labor and very dangerous, unlike much of the work adolescents in America and other developed nations perform. Due to the adult roles many adolescents take on prematurely, they are often robbed of their childhood and adolescence, and do not have the privilege of getting to develop in safe and relatively stress-free environments, as many adolescents in industrialized nations do.
Adolescent marriage is one of the key factors that lead teenage girls in developing nations to suffer emotionally and physically, and leads to extreme gender inequality in these nations. This chart shows the prevalence of teen marriage in developing countries and reveals the prevalence of marriage in adolescence, with the majority of teens in the featured developing countries marrying before age 20. In class, we learned that American young adults are marrying at later and later ages. However, this pattern clearly only impacts a certain demographic of individuals. Marriage at young ages can lead to many health complications, which is what we'll look at next.
In 2004, almost 1 million children under 18 died from injury, which is the leading cause of death in teens worldwide. These fatalities, however, are significantly greater in poorer countries. The rate of urbanization is increasing greatly in countries like sub-Saharan Africa, and with that increase comes more traffic and a higher prevalence of accidents among teens. Teens growing up in developing countries are more likely to take other types of risks as well, like drinking and smoking, which in turn lead to poorer health choices like using tobacco. A 2007 UNICEF report on child poverty, an organization for economic cooperation in development countries, indicated that adolescents who smoke are 3 times more likely to use alcohol regularly and 8 times more likely to use cannabis. This increase in risky behavior is one of the many causes of earlier death and subsequent health issues.
One of the greatest health problems seen in developing countries is early pregnancy, which is the consequence of living in cultures and environments that either don't have the means to provide protection to teens or do not have the means to advocate for safe sex properly. Furthermore, in some countries, there is a common culture surrounding early marriage, which we talked about earlier, which leads directly into teen pregnancy and several other health risks like unsafe sex. A large number of adolescent girls are forced to get married at an early age and thus have children at an incredibly early age. For this reason, they face a much greater risk of maternal mortality since their bodies are too immature to cope with childbirth. A study by the World Health Organization from 2003 found that approximately 14% of all unsafe abortions that take place in the developing world, amounting to 2.5 million that year, involve adolescents under age 20. Because of this increased risk of early pregnancy, there is also a huge discrepancy in the number of unsafe abortions between developing countries and industrialized countries like America.
As you can see in this chart, like early pregnancy, HIV/AIDS has a huge prevalence rate in developing countries as a result of unsafe sex and a huge lack of education. As we can see, there are prominent differences between the health issues in the developing world and the adolescents' experience in first world countries. And although adolescents in industrialized nations don't experience many of these health risks, it's important to realize what many teenagers across the world experience every day.
To conclude, the majority of adolescents in the world live in developing countries. These adolescents face different legal, social, and health risks than adolescents growing up in industrialized nations. The conditions for many adolescents in developing nations are generally improving, with better worldwide healthcare, better education systems, and a general increase in advocacy for human rights. But there's still much room for improvement. Although we learned mainly about American teenagers and their experience with adolescence, it's important to consider many perspectives and understand that the development of an adolescent in a first world country comes from a life of extreme privilege. Thank you. Listed below are the primary sources that we used for research in this project.